war brings out the worst in humanity. From brutal trenches of World War I all the way to the use of deplorable chemical weaponry in the modern day, countless lives have been lost by men and women alike fighting for what they believe to be right. Amongst the supposedly normal wartime events, with shells, bullets and bombs raining down upon the enemy, there have been instances where wartime became all too abnormal. So today, here at Unexplained Mysteries, we'll be taking a look at 3 mysterious wartime encounters. The Foo Fighters. By November 1944, the Allied forces were turning the tide on Axis powers in World War II. Hitler's forces had been defeated at Stalingrad a year earlier, and the Nazi war machine was beginning to break down. Now, war isn't ever a natural thing, nor something that typically happens, but some extra strange things occurred during November of 1944. These mysterious events took place in the skies above both the Pacific and European combat zones and were experienced by sailors and pilots. Allied pilots flying over Western Europe at night began to report sightings of strange lights and glowing objects in the skies around them. First seen by 2 pilots in the 415th Night Fighter Squadron near the German-French border, they noted that these objects would toy with their aircraft, undertaking a series of twists and turns before vanishing into the black abyss. Sometimes these objects would even fly in formation with squadrons, but due to their agility couldn't be shot at. They were dubbed Foo Fighters after 415th started using the name that originated from a 1930s cartoon. There are a few different theories that try to debunk the mystery of these fighters, some of which are pretty dark and others not so much. The more rational explanations to what many of the pirates saw in those war-torn skies include the possibility of a phenomenon named St. Elmo's fire. This is when light appears on aircraft wingtips when they fly through a strong electrical field, such as those produced by thunderstorms or volcanic eruptions. However, it's been argued that these distinguished and skilled military pilots would know what St. Elmo's fires looked like, and could have accurately distinguished between this and something else. Similarly, scientists and historians alike put forward the theory that military pilots, or at least those who experienced these lights and glowing objects, could have been suffering from some type of psychosis brought on by fatigue. Once again, this theory was heavily disputed, as there was very little evidence that pointed to the pilots being at risk of hallucinations. The third and most chilling theory, however, is that the objects were actually Nazi aeronautical war experiments. Some theories initially believed that the lights were V-2 ballistic missile rockets. Pilots at the time wouldn't have been familiar with them, as they were extremely modern, and the rockets also emitted an orange glowing fume from the tail's end. Strangely, the Foo Fighters began to appear during a period of rapid Luftwaffe expansion and Nazi technological advancements. Similarly, they were scarcely officially reported past the end of the war. However, it has been noted that the V-2 rocket didn't have the maneuverability of the Foo Fighters, nor the speed. Some people theorize that the fighters were the work of Wember von Braun, a Nazi astrophysicist who later worked for the US Army as part of Operation Paperclip. Whilst in Germany, von Braun worked on secret Nazi weaponry projects such as the V-2, but the fact he ended up on the Allied soil surely leaves us all thankful that he never got to develop some of the machines that may have been blueprinted in the back of his mind. In fact, von Braun would later go on to develop the Saturn V rocket, which took Neil Armstrong and Apollo 11 to the moon. The Cape Girardeau UFO crash. In 1941, the war effort was in full steam in England's farms, factories and cabinet offices. Brave soldiers were fighting and dying on the European war front, but across the pond, European counterparts were, for a short time, slightly more preoccupied with something that didn't seem quite as real: UFOs. As the story goes, local Reverend William Huffman was called by the sheriff of Cape Girardeau. He was called to read the last rites to passengers caught in an apparent plane crash late one night. Huffman rushed to the scene to perform his religious duties. The crash site was some 10 to 15 miles outside of town, and Huffman rushed to the scene to perform his duties. However, what the Reverend found when he arrived was most definitely not a crashed airliner. What the Reverend saw was instead a movie-like dish-shaped silver object. The first thought that rushed to his mind was the strange vehicle being, in fact, a UFO, and this theory would soon be backed up. After the fire and police services had dealt with the initial crash and ensuing fire, Army Air Corps allegedly arrived and cordoned off the entire area. They quickly herded up everyone at the crash site and swore them to secrecy. Any pictures or documentation were hastily confiscated. The strangest thing the Reverend claimed to have seen that night, however, was the figures that lay seemingly dead inside the silver ship. The creatures were very odd-looking, and most definitely not human. Surrounding them were a number of weird instruments, wires, and what seemed like hieroglyphic writing. They had the same bulbous heads and big eyes that you expect to see in a typical sci-fi movie. These creatures really did seem to be aliens. Huffman's granddaughter Charlotte has allegedly been unaware of the true details of her grandfather's otherworldly experience until her grandmother, on her deathbed, had relayed the story to Charlotte. A member of Charlotte's grandfather's congregation had then given her a photo of the scene of the mysterious crash. In it featured two men holding up what could only be described as a dead alien body. The crash was kept secret between the Cape Girardeau community for a long time, and was only released into the public eye some years later. However, there's still very little information surrounding the crash, and apart from William Huffman's account, we don't have too much evidence. This in turn begs the question, who holds the key to unlocking the secrets of the 1941 Cape Girardeau crash? The Hellhound of Mons. The Battle of Mons in August 1914 saw the British Expeditionary Forces push the Germans back in one of the early turning points of the war. However, the Allies suffered heavy casualties, and morale was very low in the trenches. Amongst the fury of bullets, many British soldiers reported seeing a number of angels descending upon no man's land in a way that protected the Allies from the Axis onslaught. The angels were apparently holding bows, like archers. The tales inspired the Allied troops in the many moments of hardship during the First World War. However, in the midst of the violence and fury, another more malevolent tale was coming out of the trenches. In 1919, a Canadian veteran published a rather disturbing story about the alleged Hound of Mons. The story claimed that said hound was neither a large dog nor phantom cat, but a monstrous perverted creation by German scientists. The first stories of the hound's murderous prowl came to light in November 1914. A troop of Brits had ventured into no man's land, but had never returned to those muddy, cold trenches. Nobody would have longed to be there, but judging by the fate of them, they would have rather been there, in those trenches, than alone in the battlefield with the bloodthirsty monster. Their bodies were recovered days later, with teeth marks sunken into their throats. Later that night, it's alleged that a sickening howl came over the battlefield. Other soldiers reportedly began to suffer similar fates, with large canine teeth prints imprinted on their bodies. Theories began to circulate as to what was causing these mysterious deaths. The widely accepted idea is that a German scientist, Dr. Gottlieb Hochmuller, had been tasked with creating a bloodthirsty weapon, and thus the Hellhound of Mons was his final masterpiece. It's rumoured that he had gone from asylum to asylum to find someone who had gone mad with an intense hatred for English. He then removed this man's brain and wired it into the skull of a Siberian wolfhound. In very Frankenstein-esque fashion, the Hound of Mons began to grow more powerful by the day. One night it was unleashed onto unsuspecting troops and allowed to roam free from then on. The scientist's private papers were rumoured to have been released some years later, but were never made publicly available. Alas, the Hellhound of Mons remains a sadistic and nightmarish tale from the trenches. During these wars, things that were happening, both at home and abroad, were in some cases beyond the realms of our imagination. So what do you make of these mysterious wartime encounters? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and help us by growing this community, whilst working to solve these unexplained mysteries. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.